The in-office data center has almost become a thing of the past. Almost. There's been a few of them in my past that I have loved. I love a good, awesome data center layout. There is so much planning that's required to get a data center lined up and installed correctly with all of the different things you have to coordinate with all of these different cablings, high voltage, low voltage. You got to get your cooling right. You have to pay attention to where you might have water running in the building, all these things. And when you find one that's just designed great, it's awesome. Well, let's back up though a second. Data center, right? And why are we talking about data centers? Well, data centers are the term for all of the locations where servers and services are hosted physically from. Data center is, generally speaking, going to be a reference to a physical location, not a virtual one. A traditional DC was in your building. Here's your CEO right up in the corner office. Usually somewhere, maybe in a sub-basement down where the rats are at. There'd be a few racks, a few servers all the way down here. Probably attached to a closet that might have had like the hot water heater or the HVAC. When data centers were initially put in, they were near utility access because they usually required tons of power. Now, this was a problem that was resolved by the 90s, but in the 80s, you could build your own data center in your building, but the servers were not designed at that scale yet. They were extremely power hungry. They were usually fire hazards, and they were usually extremely heavy. So our building and our data center, it's inside the building. We have internet access. That's great, right? We got the www, which means if we put a server up and host it on said www, we could effectively become our own web entity, right? And this is how everyone did it before, I would say, about 1996-ish. By the mid-90s, there were a lot of companies that were willing to host little tiny web applications, basically just web pages, like a document. And then there were companies that were doing web and cloud services, not too dissimilar from what we have now, but they were only accessible to the biggest, largest enterprises with the big, deep pocketbooks. The middle ground was pretty vacant and full of a lot of innovative, if not questionable, attempts to replicate what ultimately became our public cloud services. But in the private cloud, we were pretty much stuck with, we can host it on a server ourselves and put it in our own rack and throw it on the internet. But that meant we probably had to get a public IP, which, admittedly was a lot easier in the 90s than it was now, which meant you also had to make sure that your internet was reliable. That was not as easy back in the 90s. You also had to make sure that your power was good. That meant possibly generators. You wanted to make your web app was actually meeting some sort of service level agreement. We'll talk more about that later. Well, you had to make sure that power and everything else, which, that could include air conditioning, your HVAC. Yeah, in that last video, I kind of, painted this horde show where you end up with a very long list of things you have to take responsibility for to make sure that one web application stays up all the time. Or you could do what half the businesses did in the 90s, which is absolutely nothing and just hope for the best. But some guys came up with something called a colo. Yeah, I swear, the first time I heard this was about 18 months before I actually knew what it meant. It means co-location. It never claimed to be that smart. A colo is where your servers are going to reside that someone else is taking care of a healthy percentage of the physical junk. So in our DC, we have to take care of the servers, right? And the rack, which is the physical mount for it. The PDU, which is the power going to the servers. And then the utility power, right? Wherever we're getting that feeds the PDU. Then we have HVAC. We have to make sure that everything stays the right temperature and the bad air gets out. We also have fire controls. Also security concerns, right? We might have physical, I could go on, right? Over here in the colo, what we want is the ability to duplicate our data center for reliability purposes, but without picking up this horse show on the mean. So basically around here, the PDU, that comes over here. Everything else below that, the utilities, the HVAC, protection from fire and theft and vandalism, all that other nonsense, the co-location owner takes the responsibility for. They own that issue. So then your servers and your rack and your PDU, you move them into their building You pay for perhaps one rack, perhaps a half a rack space, perhaps 3 racks worth, and you plug them into all their stuff. They're also providing internet. I should probably have mentioned that. Internet and network access, right? So you set them up and then you have access, and then what you get is that your data center is now existing alongside this co-location, right? And then your fancy little web app can be perhaps HA, high availability, right? So you have 2 copies. So if you have a problem on one side, your customers or your guests, your clients or whatever can get to the other side. That's always awesome. But it has to be an actual separate place for it to make any difference. You see all the ridiculous things we have gone to avoid going into the public cloud space? We're still talking about private cloud here. This is stuff that's going to exist in our space. We own it. We still have control. So anyway, we got a business here that might have, say a DC with a co-location. Then a few years later, we get virtualization. You mentioned this in that last video as well. The virtualization allows us to take a large percentage of these racks that we've got in here and compress them down into much more efficient, much more power effective, much more secure and reliable, higher performing services. They're better all around. There were very few circumstances where you wanted to keep bare metal installs. So virtualization was awesome. Yay. Now, if you recall our conversation from the previous message, the general assumption that moved people into the public cloud was that this was starting to get a little complicated, a little silly, right? Because you still had to have the co-location. You still had to have 2 spots if you wanted high availability at any reliable level while still maintaining complete control of all of your data and infrastructure. We own it all. We own everything, ground to left, right, up, all of it, right? Yeah, so a lot of people moved into the public cloud because it was just getting silly, but not everybody. At one point, and that point is still a little bit today for some people, this is as far as they got. You got virtualization, you've got your co-location, you've got your primary data center. Now you're just looking to host the services that you have available within the public cloud, but you don't want to put your stuff in the private cloud. You want it private, completely internal. There are options for this. So our traditional data center and our co-location are going to play host to our varied and interesting virtualized servers, whatever we've got going on there. And those services are going to be hosting web applications, email, file services, and access and identity management. And all of those are going to be accessible by the public internet, thus serving us a proper private cloud. Private cloud services are available over the internet, but they are also available to your internal users. So you do get that benefit of hosting and benefiting from the performance of having these large-scale enterprise services available right in the same building as the people that need them most. But what about those other cloud-only services? Microsoft Azure, for instance, has things like App Insights or Azure Blob Storage, things that we can't necessarily directly replicate in our own data center nor replicate in our co-location. Well, that's true and not true. There's a special product I'm just going to make mention of here briefly called Azure Stack. If you've got a private cloud and you're interested in owning your own data and your own infrastructure entirely, but you still want to take advantage of Azure to a degree, you can bring this hardware in, your hardware, and Azure Stack can exist on it, communicating through the internet to the Azure cloud, but allowing your services and resources to access it locally as if it were part of your internal private cloud infrastructure. Private cloud really just means at this point is servers that aren't existing in a public session. You own everything. There's no sharing. There's no shared data. There's no security risk necessarily unless you misconfigure something. We'll talk a little bit more here in a few videos about the comparison between these and the others. But for the point of the AZ900, the private cloud is simply your cloud, all the way down to where the power and the concrete and the shelter from the rain come from. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.